The aim of the session today is to introduce the neutral vendor managed service model with a real-life insight from an organisation who have engaged with us to take it on, sharing some insight into how they save money, introduce control and visibility and compliance. Before I hand over to Sarah, if anyone has a question during the session, we'd like to make it as interactive as possible. So if you could just use the raise your hand function, or add something in the chat, or if you want to wait to the end, it's entirely up to you. But yeah, so without further ado, I'll hand over to Sarah to kick things off and share her screen.
Great, good morning everyone. I will just share my screen now, so bear with me till it connects. Just a quick thing, I've prepared a few slides to sort of run through some information today. But you know, we're a relatively small group. Please do ask questions as we go through. As you say, raise your hand. Once I share my desktop, I won't be able to see the hat. So Chris is going to thankfully verbally ask those questions for us today. But yeah, please do just ask me questions as you go through. Get the most out of this session as you can, really, and you know, delighted to help share our experiences, really. Okay, so I get started. I guess a little bit about myself first of all. I am head of resourcing solutions at North Yorkshire County Council. I've worked in recruitment for over 20 years. I will just about first half of that recruitment experience was in private sector as a recruitment agent, and we operated businesses in the sort of northeast and throughout Scotland as well, actually, with branches in Edinburgh and Glasgow. I guess I've got a sort of qualified background, if you like, in masters in HR and throughout recruitment and a qualified assessor. The second half of my recruitment career has been with North Yorkshire County Council, leading the service I guess I look after today, but the service is a little bit different. We're a hybrid really between an internal talent team and probably quite a lot of similarities with an external agent. We're not a commercial agent though. We do recruit for over 400 other clients, but we don't do that on a commercial fee basis. We do it sort of more on a sort of partnership and a bit more like an extension to some of those clients. So it's not a commercial outfit at all. It's just more extending our services, particularly in public sector. We know costs and budget can be really tight and limited resources. So we've just been asked quite often to support and share other people's particular things we tend to support other clients with. Tends to be executive search, so a lot of headhunting work. And we have particular professions in education and social health and social care. So we lead a couple of national programmes around that as well. And I guess the service tends to, we look at ourselves as largely delivering private sector solutions into public sector challenges, really. But we've been on quite a journey with regards to agency work ourselves. Let me sort of give you a bit of information about North Yorkshire. So for those of you that are not familiar with, I guess, the patch in the area and the context in which we utilise agency workers, it's a pretty big geographical patch and really mixed. So we've got just over 600,000 residents, 10 million tourists and 17,000 staff that work for the authority. We're the largest county in England. It takes about half a day to travel from one side to the other. And I'm sure for those of you that sort of are joining us from the Scottish area, that is probably normal operating for some of you. We've got a really mixed demography. So we're deeply rural in the sort of moors and the dales, but we have quite large market towns as well. They aren't cities. We don't have a sort of city in our area, but certainly large market towns. That gives us lots of problems. Labour market challenges massively. So some of the labour market is very sparse, really difficult to recruit. But yet we do have areas of significant deprivation. Some of our areas in Scarborough and our coastal towns are some of the most deprived in the UK. We've got high levels of unemployment and low social mobility, high levels of deprivation in that area. But equally, we've got Harrogate in another part of our county where unemployment is pretty much at zero. It's highly affluent, highly expensive place to live. So really varied. Our staffing across that 17,000 staff is anything from high volume entry level positions such as care workers, drivers, administrators, etc., right the way through the professional chain as social workers, teachers, HR, legal, finance, through to exec leaders, of course. We've got labour market challenges, really tough actually to recruit. We import older people into our patch. It's quite a nice place to come and to retire to, and we export younger people, so that has a real squashing effect really to our labour market. Young people thrive, if you like, to go to university and sort of have a more vibrant city life type of experience, and might come back to North Yorkshire a little later in life. And we've got a real mixed economy. Lots of agriculture, lots of tourism, and a huge amount of micro businesses are sort of the main ones, if you like, in and around North Yorkshire. Because of that demography, we've got a really challenging issue around agency supply. We're not the type of place that agencies come to locate. So on one hand, we've got low provision because of the demography. You know, we're not large cities. We don't have a lot of other companies that are using a lot of agency workers. And therefore, we have to rely on really the agencies that are based in and around cities and in and around borders to our patch. We're not the easiest to fill area in terms of recruitment. So again, the sort of high profit, low cost type of solution from an agency perspective, we're not a particularly attractive location to recruit in, which causes us problems really. The historic situation around agency use in North Yorkshire is we used to use, we think, about £4 million spent. That's what we know of. For those of you that work in public sector, we have to rely on financial journals and coding for that. There could well have been more, but that is what we could identify and know. And when I sort of first was tasked to look at this, it was a rehiring manager led. So hiring managers would decide which agency they would work with, following procurement rules, of course, but some of those are long-standing relationships. And from an outsider looking in, that meant that it was a very supplier-led approach to agency use, and there certainly wasn't a strategy, policy or framework around that. That's pretty problematic actually for North Yorkshire. We did have high agency margins and actually quite long assignments. I think we uncovered one that was 7 years. Now that isn't an agency worker. You know, that's a long-term member of staff, I would suggest. So, you know, we really didn't have the right use of agency work to complement really what the authority needed. Despite there being quite a close relationship between our agency suppliers and our hiring managers, there was still a level of low satisfaction. And certainly in hard to fill areas and some of our more remote areas of the county where we absolutely needed agency workers, managers were really dissatisfied with both the quality and quantity of agency workers that they got from their providers. One of the other issues we had that was really problematic was that agency workers actually, interestingly, were on preferential terms to our long-term staff, particularly in areas such as social work and actually finance, where we found that those agency workers were earning significantly more than permanent staff. Agency workers could pick and choose their assignments, and therefore the sort of permanent staff was certainly getting the raw end of that deal. That was making it harder for us to recruit permanently, and therefore our agency solution wasn't complementing you know, what we needed in terms of our long-term workforce. We had a few agencies earning a lot, and we were getting feedback from the local economy, our smaller agencies. So you might remember I mentioned that North Yorkshire has a lot of micro businesses. So we did have a lot of agency providers, but they were very niche and very small, and none of them would ever have gotten onto a preferred supplier list or found it quite difficult to engage with the authority. We're big, and you know, procurement rules, etc. It's hard to do business sometimes with us, and that was feedback from them. We also had compliance issues. So Again, for those of you that might work in public sector, we get freedom of information requests. Well, it took forever to respond to one of those. But equally, we've got safeguarding obligations and not just, if you like, other statutory requirements. And we didn't have transparency over that. And there was a few issues where those compliances just were not in place. And therefore, we had put ourselves and our service users at risk in some instances. And that definitely wasn't something we could continue with. So at the time when we were looking at this, there was a really big opportunity for us to make a change because we were trying as an organisation to achieve a huge amount of savings. Public sector austerity had really hit. And we were trying to prioritise frontline services and investing in those. And taking as much cost out of the organisation as possible. So the timing was right, as well as all of those issues, to look at agency supply. So the drivers for us when we were looking at what we should do was certainly to reduce cost and create savings, increase the quality and fulfilment, absolutely make sure we had compliance and that we had a level of assurance around that, and that the strategy started to complement and work alongside our permanent hire strategy as well. We did look at a number of options. One thing I recognised quite quickly is, having worked in the agency market, I was looking at agency supply from an entirely different lens, if you like, to what my service leads, service managers were. So service managers were a little nervous about a lot of the options, if I'm being really honest. So, their level of relationship with some of these suppliers, their control, their continuity, their comfort blanket was something that was a little uneasy for some of them to sort of think about changing. But we certainly looked at a number of options. So again, I guess free choice, preferred supplier list, master vend, neutral vend were all options we looked at. In order to decide which option was best for North Yorkshire, we engaged with key service leads for those that were the ones that were the biggest users of agency workers, and started a working group. Through that working group, we sort of took the lid off our agency use and started to analyse some of that. And then to determine, okay, so what is our predicted future demand? And therefore, which of those options would probably best fit it and meet the drivers and the objectives of that. It was essential to have that when I reflect back, because we then made a decision as a consensus group. It wasn't something that HR led. And I guess whilst I suppose I led the programme, it was that the output was as a result of that working group. And final decisions were signed off at our management board so that we had senior leadership buy-in. If I quickly chat through the different options and what were some of the sort of things we looked at. So in terms of free choice, I guess in order to drive costs down and quality up, we needed to increase competition in North Yorkshire. That was one of our biggest issues, really. So we really needed to get lots more suppliers available to us so we could really drive costs down and we could drive costs up. We're also looking about how do we leverage our economy of scale? How do we leverage that £4 million to our best advantage? And how do we think about our borders, which are important to us in terms of supply of staff, and what were they doing? So we looked at other local authorities too. So free choice wasn't going to work for us. Managers were never going to be in a position to be able to drive cost out and quality up. They didn't really quite understand the agency sort of model. They were just interested in getting the staff through the door, and understandably so. Preferred supplier list for us, we're so big and such a diverse need of requirements that preferred supplier list would need to be fairly big in order for us to make sure we could get coverage across those agency requirements. And therefore, it was a high cost model for us. We had to factor in that we weren't then leveraging our £4 million spend because it was diluted across a whole host of suppliers, and the amount of time and effort to contract manage that to make sure we were driving quality up was going to be just not worth the sort of investment, really. Master vend we looked at wouldn't work for North Yorkshire, largely because for master vend to work, the master agency would need to fill, let's say, 95% of the requirements and have strong relationships with, other agents to then provide the 5%. There is no agent in North Yorkshire that could provide to the geography and the complexity of our requirements, and we were putting all eggs in one basket. That wasn't driving the economic balance of supply and demand for us, and definitely didn't therefore present us with the lowest cost option. So we decided to go for neutral vent, and the main reasons we did that was it was about getting more suppliers into the mix. It was about making sure that the suppliers who had low cost options, high quality fulfillment, were the ones that were meeting our requirements. We had absolute transparency over agency use, agency orders, and the compliance aspect of it is something that we could touch and feel. So for every agency worker, we have a portal that we access their DBS checks, references, ID. So that felt to us the best route and how we sort of went forward. Can I just quickly check? There was a few people submitted a couple of questions before the webinar today. So a couple of those questions I think I might have gone through, but can I just sort of sense check, is there any immediate questions at this moment?
Nothing from me. I think you've answered one of my questions, so.
Right. Oh, you're welcome. As I say, if there is anything from anyone, just give me a shout. But yeah, in terms of the two questions that were before the webinar today, yeah, we explored different options. I've quickly chatted through those, and the way we got to buy into the business was that it absolutely had to take service leads and service managers with us on that journey, and educating them with an analysis and the fact rather than the myth, because their perception was very much led by suppliers as opposed to an objective view. Which was quite important to get the sort of organisation and managers on side. It made it easier because whatever solution you choose, there are always sort of starting and teething problems, embedding issues, and if the senior leaders are on board, they will back working through those issues with you. So that's certainly how we achieved it. Quickly chatting through sort of how the neutral vend has worked for us. We sort of took a dip at a sort of bit of a phased approach. So we went big bang in terms of, as of a date, we were migrated all of our agency workers to the neutral vend solution. So, hey, one of the things that played back to me through conversations with managers were their suppliers were telling them that they wouldn't take part. If that was the council's decision, they would no longer supply, and they weren't interested in being part of a neutral vend sort of supply chain. The reality was that they all migrated apart from one. Now, the only one that didn't was actually a driver agency. Now, my job for North Yorkshire County Council is to make sure that we have as an organisation what we need. So the way in which we maximised migration across was that we had a partnership approach with Matrix to sort of chat to suppliers, to work with suppliers through that journey. It's quite nice for the supplier to still see North Yorkshire County Council there alongside Matrix, so that we weren't seen to be sort of playing off each other really. And with regards to agency supply rates, the third-party margin, we tried to migrate them across to a lower cost as per our agreement with Matrix. But if there was any assignments that were a bit thorny, we honoured the original price. And then obviously for new assignments, they would be at the reduced rate. For the agent, the one agent that wouldn't transition, we basically allowed the manager to see the natural end of the assignments that played out come to an end, and any future requirements went through Matrix. We governed as well that position, because what we didn't absolutely want was off-contract spend. There is nothing more divisive to a market really if you say that this is what you're doing and then your managers go off and do something else. And so therefore, we needed to create those market competition conditions really for it to work best for us. So we did quite a lot of governance around sort of interrogating finance reports, etc., to make sure that supply wasn't happening under radar. We had transparency of cost elements. So when we first started looking at agency work, it was quite complex to try and work out what was the deal we were getting, because most agents would only ever tell us their charge rate as opposed to what was pay rate, what was holidays, what was national insurance, and the third party margin. And obviously we got now to a point where we've got entire transparency. We know where the usage is, we know how long those agency workers are on assignment, and we know whether or not our supply chain is fulfilling our requirements and how quickly they do that. So we've got a bit of a view and some measures around quality as well as that speed of fulfilment. Safeguarding is robust. So when we have an agency worker, we can see the compliance checks as we're sort of assessing whether or not we want to hire them. Matrix also do an additional compliance check, so they ratify that they're there before they make that sort of assignment live, and obviously flag if there was any issues. And that allows us to be very assured really around the fact that, if we need a DBS, it is in place, what the references are, etc. So that's quite useful. In terms of transparency as well, it's quite interesting that I don't know whether you guys, we get freedom of information requests all the time around this type of thing, so I can quite quickly respond to those. If we've got recruitment issues on the perm side, or we've got workforce issues elsewhere, I've got transparency over my agency workforce and how that all sort of fits together. We have a lot more suppliers on our supply chain than we did previously, so we've increased our supply rather than contracted it, and we've got at least 60% of those suppliers have operations in North Yorkshire. Now that was quite surprising to me, although we'd heard feedback from some of our small to medium enterprises that they couldn't quite get into North Yorkshire. That level is something we didn't quite expect, which is quite nice. We've got more economic levelling, and we know that at least 80%, if not more, of the agency workers themselves are living and working in North Yorkshire. So from our public duty, I guess, and social value, we are supporting our local workers and our local businesses. Environmental, just to touch on that, at the time when we implemented this, one of the things that was really important to us was to get rid of waste and try to utilise digital as much as possible. And certainly via using the portal that we do with Matrix, automated invoicing through sort of the online timesheet approval worked really well for us to sort of cut out the legacy, if you like, in industry sometimes of handwritten timesheets, signing those off and then signing and coding invoices individually. So that was a good opportunity for us to do our digital by default and reduce our sort of back office costs. That was really our approach in our first sort of 3 to 6 months, worked really well. We probably, savings-wise, achieved at least a 20% saving on third-party agency margins alone. So that had sort of ticked that box. Quality and fulfilment was absolutely maintained. We needed to develop the supply chain a little bit more. So, of course, we did that in partnership with Matrix and held supplier events to engage with them more to improve quality. And then because we used a tier approach in the supply chain, over time, over that 3 to 6 months, we could see the agencies that were fulfilling, that had high quality agency workers that filled our requirements quickly. And of course, they then got the reward really for that by being given the opportunity to work on future assignments and future business. We had a mandate from management board, but we wanted to consolidate that in our sort of phase 2. So we basically wrote almost sort of an agency policy. So to further identify savings, we decided to have a pay policy really around agency work. So when we requested an agency worker, we would dictate what pay rate that was on, and we would typically default to the bottom of the sort of band for what it would be for a permanent worker. Appreciate that some agency workers are used to earning a lot more than what we sort of pay. We typically would go to, through negotiation and dependent on market conditions, go to the top of our pay band, and very, very rarely would we go any higher. And we hold our nerve around that. And that's really helpful for us to, have agency workers working alongside our permanent workforce And should any of those wish to become permanent, then it's more beneficial for them to do that transfer piece. Now, that doesn't happen all of the time, being really honest. You know, if you have a very niche role, very, particular program or particular project, social workers, that's challenging, isn't it, for everyone to recruit. Engineers can be a nightmare to find. So, we try that approach, and the vast majority of times that works well. Sometimes we have to negotiate a bit around that. We also limit the amount of time that a manager can hire an agency worker. So we put a limit of 8 weeks initially on that. At the 8-week point, my team do a review with the recruiting manager. If there's just a very short-term extension, then we're really happy to support them with that, because it wouldn't make any sense to do any other type of recruitment, really. But if it's longer term, then we will actively want to manage that assignment to come to a close, and we will recruit directly. And as I said, I guess it's my job and my team's job to make sure that we fill those requirements. So we have agency work that is genuinely a temporary workforce. It's very valuable to us, but it's not at the expense, if you like, of having a detrimental effect to our permanent strategy. So it is integrated. And that created clarity in our labour market. So, if you want to be an agency worker, that's great and that's fine. And actually, we provide agents, people who inquire about that, a link, and actually on Matrix's site, the candidates can go on and have a look and see which agencies that are supplying to us in their local area, which is really handy. But equally, if they want to work permanently, they know that what route to go through. And the second phase, as I say, was about supply development as well, increasing our supply and making sure we still retained with Matrix a sort of relationship and a supply chain that worked well for us. Okay, what did we achieve, I guess? So that £4 million spend is reduced to 250k per annum at its lowest point. Obviously, agency work is changeable. Had a particularly low month last month of spending sort of 6.7k. We achieved at least 20% saving purely on third-party margin, and then, as I say, with control, assignment length, controlling a bit of the pay rate, we've obviously reduced costs further. One thing to note, interestingly, you would expect over a 10-year period for costs to have increased with inflation at least. Ours hasn't. So the third-party agency margins we negotiated, if you like, and part of the framework procurement are the same ones we enjoy today. In actual fact, over sort of contract review, etc., some of them have reduced. So that's just something to bear in mind around the ability to control costs longer term, which is not quite the case in a lot of other models. We have less than 1% of our workforce as agency. We've increased supply from a few, I guess, larger ones with to sort of over 40 regular suppliers. And as I say, 60% of those are SMEs. Robust compliance that we've mentioned. And I think we've pretty much mentioned the other things as well. Okay, so chatting through that quickly, it all sounds pretty easy, huh? It didn't feel like that at the time, possibly sometimes. So just being honest, I guess, about some of the challenges and some of the things we had to work through. So hiring manager mindset was the main one, I would say, if I'm honest. They might have had legacy agreements for a long time. Through their lens, they were just interested in making sure that they had quality fulfillment, and it was for them. One of the things I think they may be worried about was the lack of the human element. What you're telling me is this portal, this is how I order agency staff, and I don't really have conversations with the agent. It can be as human or as efficient as we. So there are some times when we utilise the portal. Who's used to ordering agency workers, he's really happy to go onto the portal and go, yeah, I want another one of them, please. Yeah, for 3 weeks next week, yeah. That's fine. He doesn't need to have the dialogue with the agency. It's a fairly straightforward ask, fairly straight. We don't really need the human interaction. It's all noise, actually. And we just get the agency workers that we need when we need them, and timesheets assigned, invoice done. So it streamlined this sort of process. However, there is a 24/7 telephone support. So for managers who are new, managers who don't usually use agency workers, most managers struggle with some symptoms or other, don't they? Then our account manager will obviously coach that to work through their agency. If we have let's say a big requirement coming up, or a very tricky, fairly detailed, complex agency requirement, niche role, then we'll either do one of two things with Matrix. We'll either, if it's a big ask, so it's a big increase in volume, we'll try to organise a bit of a supplier event where maybe suppliers, both ones, and we'll event to try and increase engagement and for us to articulate to them what we need and what's important to us. And that helps with supply and quality. Or if it's a particular role, then we will organise a conference call. Yeah, and basically give a number of agents the brief and have them recruiter. The more we understand about a role, the better I can fill that, with a candidate that's right for that. And of course, to engage with candidates, you have to have that dialogue. So that can still happen. So it can be as efficient and as digital as you need it to be, but equally doesn't mean that we can't have a human element to that. So yeah, that we had and how we've sort of overcome that challenge. Suppliers obviously knew that this is how we were going to sort of migrate. Suppliers utilise their relationships quite heavily. I guess inform managers that they didn't think it would work, that they probably wouldn't be on board. Saying, okay, well, agency work, they're our agency workers, so they won't work for you. No agent has a monopoly over a candidate. Candidate will go where the work is. Some of the things and some of the complications and some of the myths we had to bust, and that did require us holding our nerve. For me personally, what was really important was getting those leaders on board to sort of back us through that. We've got other resourcing challenges at North Yorkshire. That wasn't really the sort of purpose, I guess, of the webinar today. But yeah, as I say, I said at the beginning, really, we've had to adapt our service to do executive search. We were using agents more on perm side as opposed to sort of temporary. And we weren't really getting great lists of people to choose from, leaders we were finding very difficult to attract. We utilised exec agents, very costly, and we pretty much got a list of people who if we thought about it, probably knew more. Search headhunters in our team, if you like. And as I mentioned before, we deliver a number of different programmes, particularly focused on social work. I don't know whether any of you have a problem with social work, but we've not used agency workers actually in social work for the last 6 years. So, to make sure we had a perm solution to complement, I guess, agency provision, and we've managed to sort of manage all that requirement in-house so far. I don't know whether that leaves any questions. I wanted to sort of go through in a bit more detail. Are there any particular thorny issues that you guys have that I can help with?
Thanks for that, Sarah. I think the last minute or so, just it was a little bit broken up, so I'm not sure if anyone missed anything at all that you'd like Sarah to go back over quickly.
I think from an agency perspective, obviously I was going through our agency solutions. There were other resourcing issues that we had to handle for North Yorkshire. A lot of that through exec issues. We were finding it really difficult to find our leaders. We were hiring executive agents, and we weren't really getting response or the lists and whatever that we needed. So we've started to do that in-house, and that's, I guess, how Resourcing Solutions has developed. I did mention one of the things actually around agency supply. So children's social workers is a particular area that I'm sure a lot of people will to recruit, and we've managed to not use agency work in that particular service over the last 6 years. So yeah, there's lots of other things I guess that we do, but it's really just opening the floor to see whether or not there's any particular questions around how we've utilised agency supply.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for that, Sarah. Thanks for that insight. So yeah, obviously, anyone have any questions at all that jump to mind on the points that Sarah's covered today? Lisa, yeah, you'd like to ask questions?
I haven't got any specific questions, but I found that, you know, pretty enlightening. There's some really good information there, and I think probably quite similar issues that a lot of businesses face, whether they're in the private or public sector.
Yeah.
In terms of when you start from a hiring manager-led model where people have free rein to do as they please, and then having to kind of rein in some kind of structure and control to it. So I found, thank you.
Yeah, oh, you're welcome. It isn't easy. And I guess I couldn't initially see it through their lens. Having worked in the agency market before, I couldn't quite get why it wasn't obvious to them that we needed to do something different. So it took a lot of listening and a lot of, I guess, just and you know, working. Let's stay true to what's driving us, what's important, and you know, having that sort of, I guess, joint aim and agreed strategy, really. But yeah, a lot of time to engage with those, but that paid off dividends when we came to implementation and the benefits, because if it was fragmented and still absolutely wanting to go a different way, then we wouldn't have realised the benefits that we have. So that fairly strong mandate and that engagement piece is, I think, worked quite well in the long run.
Excellent, lovely. Okay, if no, otherwise we're going to be a pre-lunch session, so everyone can pop off and have something to eat. But listen, thanks very much for your time. We'll obviously pop the recording once we've edited it onto the website for people to see and share internally if they need to. If anyone has any other questions afterwards that they want to ask or share, I'll drop you an email. You can ask directly, and we can hook up with Sarah if needs be. But yeah, thanks so much again for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you later, guys. Bye.